In this video, we're going to go from this to this. G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. And in this video, I'm going to shed some light on how you may be able to save some time in your modeling process for character design by using base meshes. And not just any base mesh, these are base meshes that are freely available from the Blender website. That is right, Blender just brought out a bunch of cool pre-made base meshes, both realistic and stylized, that will empower you to be able to make your own characters without all of that rigmarole, without any of the stress of having to make something from scratch. So we're going to explore and see whether or not this is going to actually help us, or will it slow us down? Well, let's find out. But first, a huge shout out to Southern Shoddy, who has provided me with an affiliate link for his new dynamic VFX pack, where it is completely generated in geometry nodes, where you can generate anything from fire to electricity to whatever you want. Check it out in the link below. If you purchase from the link below, you also help me out, you help him out, and you help out the Blender community as a whole. So I would really appreciate it if you would check it out. Okay, so let's just jump right in and see how we can actually get these base meshes from the Blender website. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is go to the Blender website, click on download, and then go to the demo file section of the website. Now, Blender offers all kinds of crap, but the thing we want to get is the human base meshes, and these are completely free. You can download them, you reuse them, there's no license involved, it's completely Creative Commons, open for use, whatever. Just another reason why Blender is pretty awesome. Now, once you open up the file in Blender, you'll see there's a bunch of stuff, not only just bodies and different kinds of stylizations of the bodies, but you also get individual components like heads, hands, eyes, feet, even skulls, which is really cool. And the file has been set up in a way that if you were to put this into your asset library in Blender, you should be able to drag and drop different parts into your scene without having to re-import everything every single time. So you could set this up as an asset library within Blender. Now, looking at the topology here, it's obviously geared towards sculpting and making these models your own. It is animation friendly, but there are some things for me that I would prefer to see, like proper edge flow around the hips. Even weight painting these sort of things can be a real bitch when they're just gridded up like that around the hips and the crotch. That being said, overall, the actual topology is really good. So even if you sculpt on top of this or change the model in any way, you have a really solid base to turn into an animation rig. So there shouldn't be that much in terms of fix-ups that you may have to do. The other cool thing is that you get both a realistic and a cartoon proportion set for both male and female. So if you want to go with that sort of Pixar-esque proportion level, you have that there from the get-go to work with. Now, of course, you can go ahead and change these as much as you want, which we're going to do today, but having that as a sort of guide is really cool to see. Furthermore, we also get feet, hands, skulls, etc. And it's really cool to see stylized hands and a realistic hand side by side to see just how different they can be, and also the topology. And although they aren't like obviously visible in this scene here, you may notice that on the bottom of my screen, there is assets for eyes, mouths, skulls, jaws, teeth, everything like that. Now, for me, I love that because every time I do a model, the last thing I think about is always like the jawline or the teeth or whatever, and I usually end up forgetting about it until I really need to start rigging it, so I end up modeling it after the fact. Now, having these right here allows me to just drag and drop them into my models, and if I want to go with a stylized look, stylized teeth don't really have to be that different between models because, again, they're pretty simple. Now, looking directly at the hand topology here, you can see it's pretty straightforward. Now, there isn't any crazy loops or any defining characteristics about the way they've structured the hand. And then going into the body, you will see that in the realistic sculpted versions is that there's already a multi-resolution sculpt pass on top of this. Now, that's for better or worse, because you'll probably end up needing to delete that if you're going to go with a really different character. But you can see that that detail isn't baked into the character set. Okay, so if you're going to export out these without any modifiers, you'll find that where's all the abs, where's all the details, where's the kneecaps, all that sort of stuff. That's not in the actual geometry itself. It's a sculpt path already laid on top. So that's a great reference for your anatomy study, but it's not great if you plan on redoing this entire character. Now, depending on your needs as a character artist, you may have to go with the realistic base mesh or the stylized base mesh. And today I'm going to go with the stylized base mesh because I have a stylized character to work with. I don't need that detail. Okay, so starting from the top, I've got a brand new scene, and I briefly want to show you how you can link up that file as an asset library. So what you can do is go to your file preferences, and then you add the file location folder path to that asset library list. Now, if you have multiple files, you probably have a location already on your computer that you can use. But if you don't, make a folder, put all your blend files in there, and then add that as a user library folder. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So here's how you go about it. So click on the add button. You're going to navigate to the folder in which your blend file exists, in this case, this asset folder, and then add the folder itself. You don't have to worry about adding every single file individually. It will search for blend files within that folder and then add them to an asset library within Blender. So if we go to our asset libraries list here, you can see here now that we have not just our hair curves that are default in Blender now, but we also have the base meshes. Now, hopefully in the future, maybe they may be included in the asset library automatically, but for now they aren't. Now, if you drag and drop them in, you will see they are basically being proxied into the file, i.e. a library override. So in order to edit this, we will need to basically import them directly. All right, so to get started, I'm just going to drag and drop the stylized female model into the scene and then just center it to the world. And for some reason, I tried like appending this without with library overrides, but it didn't seem to want to work. So what I did is I kept my object selected and I went to object, and then I went to relations, make local, and then set it to all. And what it did is create a duplicate of my object. It offset it, but it's a duplicate, which is now editable inside of the viewport. I deleted my old one, and then I recentered this model that is now editable to the center of my world. Okay, so now with that ready to roll, we are ready to edit this model. We need to bring in our reference. So I have made a front-on reference of my character, which is an adaptation from the original sketch made by Panomi, which you can see in the top of the image sketch there. Looks amazing, but it's not perfect for doing these sort of sculpts and this sort of adaptations, so I need to create a reference image. So I'm just going to line up that image reference to the center of the world and bring it up to the right scale and height of the base mesh model. I'm then going to go ahead and just do a few adjustments to make it a little bit easier to see inside the viewport. So with the null or empty selected, I'm going to turn on opacity and bring that down. And I'm going to have it set the depth to front view. So no matter when I'm in the front view, I'll always see the image, but I won't really see it when I move the camera around inside the viewport in perspective mode, which is great because it won't get in the way of like doing 3D sculpting stuff. Okay, so here comes the fun part. This is when the fun part begins. So once we've got all that set up, we are now ready to start to adapt the base mesh to the sketch. Now, for some people, this may be maddening. You may absolutely hate this process. For other people, it might be a complete lifesaver. So if you don't really like to do a lot of the hard modeling stuff, but you just want to like line up something, this might be the method for you. So inspect the model before you get going, see what is adaptable, what isn't, and then start to move things around. See what kind of detail is in the base mesh before you start moving verts around, and get an understanding of what you can and can't do with the base mesh as well. Because if the topology doesn't really support that, it's going to be a lot harder to get that detail in the right spots. Now, straight away, I don't really want to have to do both the left and the right alignment. So what I'm going to do is actually auto mirror this model, which is essentially going to delete one side of the model and then mirror it with a mirror modifier. And that's a plugin you can turn on inside of Blender's default set of plugins. So just type in auto mirror and it will be visible there, and you can just turn it on. That will basically just mirror the object for you. It will add the modifier for you, and you can just get started. So with that being said, The model is now going to be mirrored. And if I go into edit mode, you'll see that now only half of the model is available to me. Now, pros and cons about doing this is that you basically destroy the UV maps that have been built into the model, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, obviously, depending on the character you're going to make, you probably have to redo the UVs anyway. But just keep that in mind if you are going to go with this methodology. I'm going to turn on proportional editing now. And then I'm going to start to manipulate the mesh as much as I can to fit the sketch. Okay, so when I look back at my raw recordings of this video, it took me around 2 to 3 hours to realign the entire model to fit my sketch. That's not including the clothing that I add. That's not including any additions like hair. Just to align the proportions and the look of the character to fit my model, or my model sketch, took around 2 to 3 hours. This will be different for you depending on how familiar you are with Blender's toolset, how familiar you are with doing this sort of thing, like just modeling in general, and also just what kind of tools you have. So do you have a sculpting tablet, like a drawing tablet to work with, or are you just using a mouse? That sort of stuff. Are you familiar with just the basic stuff about modeling in general? That's actually a big deal when it comes to even just doing this sort of stuff. So having a fundamental understanding of modeling principles is still gonna be really important for this sort of stuff. You can't just like go into this thinking, oh, I don't know how to model, I don't know how to sculpt, but I got the base mesh, I can get it done. That's not the right mindset to think of. You still need to understand that you need the fundamentals to be able to pull this off effectively. Otherwise, you're going to be going into something like this, like so unprepared. You're going to get so frustrated, and in the end, you're just going to like say, "Fuck it, I'm not going to do this. Screw this. This is stupid." So this is really more of an intermediate methodology, in my opinion, as well. Base meshes really exist not because you don't know how to model something, but because you can't be fucked doing it. You know how to do it, but you can't be fucked anymore. Especially when you have tight deadlines, you have limited resources in terms of budget and time, that having a base mesh to start off with is more beneficial than doing everything from scratch. Which is why I'm going to have to time lapse this. Okay, now, if you want the unfiltered version of this where I'm just literally just doing the whole thing at regular speed, no commentary, and you just want to see the process as I'm doing it at real time, I will be uploading the entire 7 hours or so worth of content up on my Patreon. So you'll be able to download the entire 7 hours. It's completely up to you. And that will also include the texturing methodology that I do in Substance. So if you want to check that out in its entirety, by all means, as little as $3 a month, you can get all this content. That being said, for a broad explanation about what I'm doing here, stick around and watch the video. So what I do is a combination of both sculpting and just pushing and pulling verts around. Now, you can't really get away with doing the entire thing just with a sculpt, in my opinion. I think it's really frustrating. It's a really clunky way of doing things. And sometimes it's just easier to just push a few verts here and there and get them into place and then do a sculpt to clean it up. So you will see that I will push and pull along the knee joints. I'll push and pull along the hips. I'll push and pull with soft selection to get what I need. And in some cases, I will actually delete areas of the mesh that I don't think I need. So for instance, this character has cat ears. Now, I don't need to have cat ears and human ears in the same model. So I'm going to delete the ears. Now, again, this is why having a relatively decent understanding of how mesh flow works, how topology works, is important. Because ultimately, you are using the base mesh as a starting point. You're not using it as the be-all and end-all for your model. It is expected that you go ahead and change the model to suit your needs. It's just giving you a head start. A base mesh isn't a shortcut in the sense that you think it might be, where it's just a magic pill that will make all your models look great. That's not the case. In fact, you'll probably go through a stage just like you would with regular sculpting, where the model just looks absolute dog shit, okay? You get that alien look still, even when you have a really good starting point, okay? So you'll see that the face will look pretty creepy for a lot of the time in this session. And also the body goes from looking relatively humanistic to creepy alien pretty quickly. And just like any modeling session, it's always good to have a plan. Okay, you have an idea, at least in your head, about what you want to do with the character. Like, how much do you want to animate? Are you planning on doing clothing changes, all that sort of stuff? Okay, so in this case, like, I don't need the full realistic feet. Okay, because I'm gonna put boots on this character. I don't plan on showing her without any clothes or anything like that. So I'm just not gonna worry about lining those up. I'm just going to delete them. I don't need to think about that level of complexity. Okay. So this is another trap that a lot of people get into when they are doing character design for the first time, is they always think of the what ifs. Oh, what if I want to do this with the character? Or what if I want to do that with the character? Okay, in the next animation, am I going to have the character swap clothes? And in that moment, that's where the idea of scope creep really starts to show its ugly head. All right. Now, what you should be doing if you're doing this for the first time is just do the changes for the project at hand. Don't worry about the what ifs, just worry about the now and get it out the way. Worry about the problem later if you plan on doing another episode or another animation with the same character, which requires to have their feet showing for some reason. All right. Otherwise, right now, just worry about getting this thing to look good for the task at hand. In my case, the task at hand is to adapt the character from one of my patrons. I'm not planning on animating it in any crazy kind of way. I'm not going to have them throw off their clothes or do a dance with their feet showing, nothing like that. So I'm just going to go with whatever I see on the sketch. I'm going to make that the priority. So my first initial thing that I want to do, even though again the character is wearing clothes and I just talked about what I was aiming for a few seconds ago, I'm still going to sort of at least get the proportions of the underlying anatomy right, because I plan on putting clothes on top of it, right? So I want to give it the right kind of mass. All right. So eventually I might even hide that away. I might delete it. I'm not sure. But at least having that as my base mesh for my clothing, I can at least put the clothes on top of it and know that the volumes are going to be correct. The other thing I'm not going to worry about is having like full-on realistic breasts, because again, the character is wearing a shirt. I don't need to worry about separation, for instance. I don't have to worry about volume in that regard. I just need to have a shelf, essentially, to indicate where the clothing will sit upon, okay? So again, this is another thing that especially guys get into their head, is that, ooh, I gotta sculpt them titties. No, you don't, all right? If the character's wearing clothes, you don't need to do that, all right? The other thing you may notice is that my reference doesn't really have a side view, okay? So I'm going to make some assumptions on my part about how this character's posture is going to be sitting in relation to my sketch. Now, you can just follow some basic sort of balance rules. So what I mean by that is that understand that there's still meant to be some level of balance in the way that the character is standing in a neutral sense. So you don't want to have the character leaning too far forward or too far backwards or anything like that. But having a natural sort of flow in the side view will give it the right kind of feel. Now for the ears, I'm not going to go too crazy with this. Again, I only spent 2 hours on this, or this initial anatomy thing, and then I did a little bit of a pass on top of it. But again, it's only going to be like a 2-second render. So I don't want to get too far into the details, especially if it's a smaller feature. Okay. So in this case, I just extruded out a box from the head and then just sort of shaped the subdivisions to look like ears. Very simple indeed. But again, you don't want to go, like, again, it depends on the project that you're working on, how much you're committed into the character, whether the character is going to be used extensively. But if it's just for a little project, don't worry too much about it. So this character also has a tail. So again, very simple extrusion, straight from the back, above the butt, a cylinder, and then subdivide that to be able to be rigged. But I'm not going to shape the tail because the character is still going to be rigged as an animation character. It's best to keep the tail straight so you can rig it in a reasonable way, an easy way, without having to worry about rigging up a loop. or a swirl in the tail. It also keeps the animation looking clean when you want to sway the tail side to side. The other thing I'm doing as well is I'm adding a multi-resolution modifier on top to help sculpt out some details. Now, the cool thing about the multi-res in Blender is that once you've done the multi-res, you can apply that to the base mesh, to the underlying geometry. It won't retain all the detail, but it will help realign the values and the volumes of the mesh to suit the sculpt. So when you turn off the multi-res, you at least keep the volumes. So that's really cool. So that means for details such as the clavicle that I'm adding here on top, I don't have to worry about sort of realigning the mesh flow. I can push the apply base button in the multi-res and it'll at least bring some of that detail into the basic geometry. And if I want to keep that detail there, I will just keep the multi-res turned on when I go to render out the animation. Or I would bake that detail down to a displacement map or a normal map in Blender. But in this case, I'm not going to worry about doing that. Now, just for the sake of fun, I'm just adding a little bit of volume around the torso to give it that nice sort of feel, just in case my patron wants to have a look at it and, inspect the model. Okay, so I figured if I've created the character body with a base mesh, why not readapt some of my old files to do the clothing? So I actually looked back at some of my old Black Curtain stuff, especially the very early character development concepts that I was creating, and I found some really cool clothing that I could readapt for this character, and it actually matches perfectly. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how I went about readapting those and why it might be useful for you to go back to some of your old files and reuse some of the assets you've already created. Not only saving you time, but also saving you the stress of having to create something from scratch. All right, so continuing the methodology of using reference objects, I'm not going to model the clothing from scratch. All right, so this is an old Eevee model from back when I was doing Black Curtain, the first episode. This is from years back at this point. And I had this really nice jacket that pretty much perfectly matched the jacket that is in the reference image. So I'm not going to remodel that. I'm going to go ahead and just repurpose something I've already made. And there's nothing wrong with that. Unless you're doing something that has like IP attached to it, as in like you've done it for a client and they said, no, you can't do that. If you just have assets that you've made for yourself and you want to reuse them, you should reuse them where you can. Why waste time? Now, this took the process of creating the clothes down from, several hours to maybe an hour or two. So much, much faster to get this done. And having this jacket ready to roll was great. It already had the UV maps. It was unwrapped. The only thing I had to do is get rid of some areas around the collar, and it was ready. It was done. Now, that's what I recommend if you have previously done some work that you're happy about to reuse. You should repurpose them. They become new base meshes for you to use. There's nothing wrong with that. And I've done the same thing with the singlet. So I took Eevee's singlet that I did, it would have been like 2-3 years ago at this point. And I just reused it. It lined up quite well with the proportions of this character as well, especially with cartoony characters. Like if you go with the golden ratio, I guess you can say, a lot of characters tend to stay within the same sort of proportion set. But yeah, it worked out really well. Now, if I didn't have these ready to roll, if I didn't have the singlets and the jacket ready to roll, that's where creating a duplicate of your base body comes in handy. That's why I did it initially, because I wasn't even thinking about reusing the jacket at one time. As you can see, I literally duplicated the pants from the original mesh of the character and then just sort of scale them along the normals, and then I've done a sculpt pass on top of it to get the pants looking the way they do. Much more efficient than trying to model around the body that you just created. Use the body as a secondary base meshes within base meshes, so you can save time. And this is one of the things that blows my mind when I see a lot of tutorials on doing clothing, specifically for stylized characters, that they start to model around an existing model. Like, why would you do that? What's the fucking point? I mean, not only are you going to have a different level of geometry density if you're going to animate that, you're wrangling with the idea of modeling around volumes, which is ridiculous. Just duplicate the mesh, take the parts you need, scale them slightly outwards along the normals, and then modify as needed. Much more efficient. Now, here's the pretty much the only thing that I really modeled from scratch, which is the boots. That's the only thing I did. And I'm not using the feet as volumes here because I didn't really care. I'm just modeling from scratch in this case. Like, I don't have a boot lying around, and if I downloaded a boot from online, it wouldn't match the level of detail that I have for the character here. I wanted to keep it relatively stylized, relatively simple. I'm not going to add like shoelaces or anything like that. So I'm not going to go ahead and use a pre-made asset for that. So in this case, I made the call that, yeah, it won't take me long to do a boot. I can do a boot. Let's get it done. All right. So like, again, it's about making the call on a creative level. Okay, so if you can't be bothered doing it, yeah, you can try and find a model or use an AI to generate a bloody shoe. But you may find that even with those new tools that we have, you may find yourself spending hours just trying to find the right model where you probably could have just modeled something in about 25 minutes. Okay, it's trade-offs. If I can do it quicker myself, then I'm gonna do it myself. All right. Now, I do want to add a caveat to this whole idea of speed, okay? Now, this is an approach that I'm following based on sort of a professional scenario, okay? Now, this is one of the things that really, really pisses me off in sort of the 3D sort of space or anything creative is that the expectation that you need to be fast, all right? If you are not doing this sort of stuff for commercial purposes, if you're doing it for fun, if you're doing it for learning, if you're doing it for yourself, then speed does not matter. You can take as long as you fucking want to get something done. It can take months, it can take days, or it can take years. It really depends on what you want in terms of outcome. If you're just doing something to learn, don't try and do it quickly. Just do it at your own pace. All right? I see this all the time on comments. Oh, how do you get fast? How do you get fast? The only way you get fast is by doing the job professionally. It forces you to be fast. But apart from that, you will never know how fast you need to be until you are in the shit. Okay? If you're in the shit, you'll get it done fast. If you're not, you're not gonna. You don't need to. All right? Take your time. Enjoy the process. Don't get frustrated because you think that you have an internal deadline in your head of getting something done. That doesn't exist. All right? The deadline doesn't exist in your head. That's it. You know, just do it at your own pace. Enjoy it. It doesn't matter. If you want to try this method out, do it at your own pace. If it turns out to take longer to do it this way than doing it from scratch, then that's fine. It doesn't mean you're a bad artist or you're not using the tool properly. It's just that you like the other way better. That's it. So you don't need to use a base mesh if you don't want to. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so now that I've done the model, which is pretty much done, I want to get the hair done. Now, I really wanted to test out Blender's new hair asset library. They're a bunch of preset geometry nodes things that basically let you just plonk on geometry nodes and then you can sort of sculpt hair. So I wanted to give that a go. All right, so I've got the body, we've got the clothing, and now we're going to add a little bit of hair. Now, the way we can make hair in Blender has changed a little bit since the last time I've talked about it, especially given the addition to hair curves. So hair curves are really cool because they're based on the geometry nodes sort of underpinnings. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages with using the hair nodes in that they can't really be animated that very easily, and they haven't yet been fully supported by the simulation nodes that have recently been added inside of Blender. Now, that may change in the future. Whether that's going to happen sooner or later, don't really know, but hopefully sooner rather than later. Otherwise, the only real purpose for making your hair using hair curves is basically for look dev. which I talk about in the time lapse coming up. Now, if you do want to animate these hair curves, there are workarounds. There are plugins you can find, but again, that may change. The support might end, and you kind of are better off using the traditional simulation particle system to create hair if you're going to go forward with that. Now, you can convert hair curves into particles, all right? But there is one fatal flaw, and then there is a bug inside of Blender where if you manipulate or cut the hair curves, or for some reason, if you manipulate the length of the hair that has been created, it doesn't simulate properly. All right, so basically it's useless anyway. All right, so whether you're going to go down the animated route for hair or whether you're going to go down the just look dev route for hair, it's something you may want to look into going forward. Now, in a time lapse, I kind of just give a general overview of the advantages of using hair curves. So I'm not going to really do a full tutorial just yet. But once those sort of niggles have been solved, I do plan on creating a tutorial series on creating hair that can then be animated in the future. But for now, I'm going to put a pin in it and I'm going to wait until those features are ready. That being said, I just want to show you a few things you can do with the hair curve system. Now, if you do want to get a little bit more information about hair curves and how they work, Southern Shoddy does in fact have a really good overview on how to use hair curves for character design. So I'd really recommend you check out his channel to find some really cool information about that. Okay, so let's talk about the hair nodes in Blender. Now, the hair nodes, in essence, are fucking amazing. All right? They are actually awesome. With caveats, okay? There always are with these new features. Now, the cool thing about the hair nodes is that once you've unwrapped, you need to unwrap a portion of the head, a UV unwrap, to make it work. So basically, once you've got a portion of the head that you've sort of separated from the skull, so you've made a duplicate of your skull or your head model, and then just took the parts that you need to have hair on it, and then just separated that, and then you UV unwrap that, you can then add hair curves onto the mesh. And then on top of that, you can start to add stuff like waves and frizz and subdivide the hair, make it more stylized, whatever you want. Now, it is really cool. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about how it all works because there's lots of videos out there already on how to do it. And when it comes to me actually doing a video about it, I want to make sure that when I do make a video about it, it actually is applicable for animation. Okay? Because right now, the hair tool in Blender doesn't really work. The new feature set doesn't work with animation. You can like rig it to a armature, but you won't have simulated hair movement, which for me, at least as an animator, isn't great. Okay, great for doing stylized sort of pictures like this, but until it can be like simulated, it's kind of useless, honestly. You can convert it to standard hair curves, and as long as it's working, it will work, but in this case, it doesn't. So apparently there's a bug in Blender that they're not going to fix because they're basically grandfathering the old hair simulation set, where if the hair curves aren't attached properly to the skull, or you've manipulated the length of it for some reason, the simulation doesn't work, which sucks. And it explains a lot when it comes to me working within my black curtain animation. The wolf animation fur wouldn't work half the time because there's actually this bug. All right, but what it is great for is look dev. Okay, so if you're doing a character design and you're designing the hair, you can do the geometry nodes method, which is far more efficient, far more performant, and far more easy to use than using the hair simulation toolset. That's all I want to talk about here, is that using the toolset in the sort of hair curve methodology is awesome. But there are still limitations. So for instance, there are ways in the grooming toolset of the old school hair that allows you to sort of choose how far the intersection works within the mesh. You can't really do that very well with this. The mirroring isn't as good with the hair curves as well. So there are some sort of growing pains with this methodology. But yeah, until the hair curves can actually be properly animated and controlled on an animation level, I will probably still lean toward the old school simulation set for now, personally. But for this sort of like stylistic look dev, yeah, I'm great. I'm happy to use it. The other thing is, the cool thing about the hair curves here is that you can actually do really easy stylized styles. So you don't have to have like super thin strands. You can actually turn it into a sort of anime style hair and then add an anime shader on top of it, and it will actually look pretty damn good. It's really cool for that. And you can actually manipulate or alter, if you're any good at using geometry nodes, you can alter the hair curves to be anything. You can turn them into anything, which is really cool. That's the glory that is geometry nodes. Now, once they pair this with the brand new simulation node set, which they haven't added to curves quite yet, unfortunately, once those two come together, then I'll be ready to do a full-blown tutorial. Now, I'm not sure how long that's going to take for them to develop that at Blender Foundation, but that's what I'll be holding out for before I choose to do a more in-depth tutorial. In the meantime, I would recommend checking out Southern Shoddy's overview video on how to use the hair curves, because he goes through the modifier stack and how it all works. And I think that's a really good introduction on how to use it. I will put the link to that video in the description. Okay, so on top of that, I'm just going to use the principled hair shader to get the blonde hair to work, and it's pretty straightforward, really easy to use. So just have a look at that. And then a few tweaks to the geometry, and then it's ready for texturing. Now, this video is already going a little bit long, 35 minutes and counting. So I was planning on showing the texturing process, but I don't think it's going to fit here. So what I'm going to say is that you can sign up to Patreon and download the entire, I guess you can say, recording session of me texturing up the character. And that's another 3 hours, I think, on top of the 5 hours I think I spent on the modeling process. So if you want to check out that, you can. And again, if you want to see a proper full-blown, whether it's Blender or Substance Painter texturing material tutorial, like a more up-to-date version of that, let me know in the comments. I'm gathering ideas at this point. So I know there was interest in the compositing side of things that I mentioned in the previous video. And now, if you are interested in a little bit of texturing, a little bit of that, specifically in Substance, I know it's a bit contentious, knowing that, you know, it's a paid software, let me know. Maybe I can do a video about that as well. That being said, we're coming to the end of this video and onto the reveal. All right, so we're kind of running out of time here, and I really wanted to show you a few things about texturing. I've got a whole recording done on just texturing this character, but we're kind of running out of time with this video. So what I want to do is I'm going to chuck up the raw recording up on Patreon. So if you want to get access to that, feel free to sign up to Patreon. It'll be accessible to anyone who signs up, whether it's the $3 account or the $5 account, depending on how generous you are. Feel free to go with the cheaper option if you want to. Now, I'm also going to be opening up YouTube memberships. So this raw recording will also be available as an exclusive on my membership tier. So you can download those, watch them through YouTube, or you can go to my Patreon, sign up there, and get access to them there. All right, so before we move on, let's go ahead and check out the final result of the render. So with all the texturing done, all the camera set up, the lighting set up, here's what we got in the end. All right, so what did you think? I think it looks really cool. Now, to think that we've gone from a really basic base mesh to something that's completely unique and completely designed, we wouldn't think that it was made from base mesh, by the way, is really, really cool. All right, so if you want to try it out, these resources are actually available for free through Blender. You no longer have to go to ArtStation or some other asset pack online to find high quality base mesh models. They're all there. Download them right now if you want to give it a go. Now, that being said, as I mentioned in the time lapse, if you find that this isn't a very comfortable method for you, that's completely valid as well. If you want to do something from scratch, go ahead and do it. It's fine. These are just accessible for those who just want to explore the sort of principles behind character design, especially for film and animation. And you get to study things as well. So you get to study the base meshes, study the edge flow, how things work, whether things are better off in your way or whether it's better off in the way that they've been designed in the base mesh already. So yeah, check it out, give it a go. It's really fun. And I can't wait to see what you create from these base meshes. So if you create anything, feel free to tag me on Instagram or Twitter, well, X, and yeah, share away. Otherwise, join up to my Patreon, chuck up your artwork on the Discord that is available through my Patreon. All right. So until then, catch you later, have fun, and I'll see you later.